The December wind cut through Violet Harper's threadbare coat like 1,000 tiny knives as she stumbled through the snow-covered streets of Beaver, Utah, her boots leaving uneven tracks behind her in the deepening drifts. She had been walking for 3 days straight since the stagecoach broke an axle 40 miles back, and the driver had taken the only horse to ride for help, leaving the passengers to fend for themselves in the brutal winter of 1881. Most had headed toward the mining camps to the east, but Violet had chosen to push south toward Beaver, hoping the small Mormon settlement would offer some measure of charity to a woman alone. The whimpering sound that stopped her in her tracks was so faint she almost missed it beneath the howling wind, but when she heard it again, something in her chest tightened with recognition of another living thing in distress. She found the dog half buried in a snowdrift behind what looked like an abandoned freight office, its golden fur matted with ice and mud, ribs showing through its sides like the bars of a prison. The animal's brown eyes looked up at her with such desperate hope that Violet felt tears freeze on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. She had nothing to give, barely enough strength left in her own body to make it to whatever passed for a boarding house in this frontier town, but she could not leave this creature to die alone in the cold. With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned her coat and wrapped it around the shivering dog, pulling the animal against her chest, despite the blast of frigid air that immediately struck her body through her thin cotton dress. "Come on, girl," she whispered, though she had no idea if the dog was male or female and did not care. "We will find somewhere warm together, I promise you that." The dog whined softly but did not struggle as Violet forced her legs to move again, one foot in front of the other down the main street of Beaver. The town was small, perhaps 24 buildings clustered along the road with the Tushar Mountains rising like white-capped sentinels in the distance. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Violet felt her heart lift slightly at the sight. Where there was fire, there was warmth, and where there was warmth, perhaps there was mercy. She passed a general store with shuttered windows, a small church with a steeple that seemed to pierce the gray sky, and several houses that looked neat and prosperous, despite the harsh landscape. No one was on the streets in this weather, and for that she was grateful because she knew how she must look, a madwoman carrying a filthy dog against her body while snow collected in her dark hair. The livery stable appeared ahead like a vision from heaven, its wide doors partially open to reveal golden lamplights spilling onto the snow. Violet aimed herself toward it with single-minded determination, no longer feeling her feet inside her wet boots, no longer caring about propriety or permission. She would beg if she had to, plead on her knees for shelter for herself and this animal that had somehow become her responsibility in the span of minutes. As she stumbled through the doorway, the sudden absence of wind made her gasp, and the relative warmth of the building hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled, and she felt herself falling forward, still clutching the dog against her chest. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground, and a deep voice said something she could not quite make out through the ringing in her ears. She was being lifted, carried, and then she was being lowered onto something soft, straw perhaps, and someone was wrapping a heavy blanket around her shoulders. The dog was whining again, and Violet tried to hold tighter to protect this creature that depended on her, but her fingers would not obey her mind's commands. "Easy there, miss," the voice said again, and this time she could focus enough to understand the words. "You are safe now. Let me see to the dog, and then we will get you both warmed up proper." Violet forced her eyes open and found herself looking up into the most striking face she had ever seen. The man kneeling beside her was perhaps 25 or 26 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. His jaw was covered with several days of stubble, and there was a scar along his left cheekbone that gave him a dangerous look, despite the obvious concern in his expression. He wore a simple work shirt and vest, both covered with bits of hay and dust, and his hands were large and calloused as they gently unwrapped her coat from around the dog. "Please," Violet managed to say through chattering teeth. "The dog, she needs help." "I can see that," the man replied, his voice steady and calm. "And so do you, miss. When did you last eat?" Violet tried to remember and could not. "Yesterday. The day before." Time had become strange and fluid during her journey through the snow. "I have no money," she said instead, because that seemed more important to establish up front. "I cannot pay for lodging or food, but I can work. I can clean or cook or mend, whatever needs doing." The man looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his features. Then he nodded once decisively and stood up with the dog cradled in his arms. "First things first," he said. "I am going to tend to this animal, and you are going to sit right there and drink this." He moved to a small stove in the corner of the livery and ladled something from a pot into a tin cup, which he brought back and pressed into her hands. The cup was hot enough to hurt, but Violet held on to it anyway, feeling the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. The liquid inside was coffee, strong and bitter, and the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She sipped it slowly while the man worked on the dog, his movements efficient and practiced as he rubbed the animal down with towels and checked for injuries. "No frostbite that I can see," he said after a few minutes. "She is half-starved and probably has worms, but nothing that cannot be fixed with food and care. You found her like this?" "Behind a building," Violet said, her voice growing stronger as the coffee worked its way through her system. "I could not leave her." "Most folks would have," the man observed without judgment. "It is a hard winter and people are looking after their own." "I could not," Violet repeated, and she met his eyes steadily. "I know what it feels like to be left behind." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the mouth and eyes that made him look younger and more vulnerable. He nodded slowly and returned his attention to the dog, who was beginning to revive under his ministrations. The animal licked his hand tentatively, and Violet saw a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "My name is August Garrett," he said without looking up. "I own this livery stable and the land behind it. I have a small cabin out back where I live. It is not much, but it has a good stove and a roof that does not leak. You are welcome to stay there until you get your strength back and figure out what you want to do next." Violet stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You would take in a stranger, just like that?" August glanced up at her and his gray eyes were serious. "You saved this dog when you barely had the strength to save yourself. That tells me something about your character, miss." "Harper," Violet supplied. "Violet Harper." "Miss Harper," August continued, "I have learned to trust my instincts about people, and my instincts say you are someone worth helping. Besides, I could use someone who can cook and mend, like you said. I am a fair hand with horses, but my domestic skills leave much to be desired." A laugh bubbled up in Violet's throat, surprising her with its intensity. "I can cook," she promised. "My mother taught me before she died. I can make bread and stew and pies, and I know how to stretch ingredients to make them last." "Then we have an arrangement," August said, and he stood up with the dog still in his arms. "Come on, let me show you the cabin. This little girl needs food and rest, and so do you." Violet pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly as the blood rushed to her head. August steadied her with his free hand, and she was acutely aware of his size and strength next to her own fragile state. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with broad shoulders that came from years of hard physical labor. She felt small and weak beside him, but also strangely safe, as if his presence alone could keep the cold and danger of the world at bay. The cabin behind the livery was indeed small, just one room with a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, a stove, and some shelves for supplies. But it was warm and clean, and to Violet it looked like a palace. August set the dog down near the stove and then went to rummage through his supplies, pulling out a piece of salt pork and some dried bread. He broke the bread into small pieces and soaked them in water before offering them to the dog, who ate with desperate hunger that made Violet's heart ache. Slowly, August murmured to the animal, "You will make yourself sick if you eat too fast." He rationed out the food carefully, waiting between servings to let the dog's stomach adjust. While he worked, Violet looked around the cabin with growing appreciation for its simplicity and order. Everything had a place, from the neat stack of firewood beside the stove to the row of tools hanging on the wall. This was the home of a man who valued practicality and self-sufficiency, someone who had learned to rely on himself in a hard land. "There is a basin behind that curtain," August said, nodding toward a corner of the room. "And clean water in the pitcher. You should wash up and get into some dry clothes. I have an extra shirt and pants that will be too big on you, but they are better than that wet dress." Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks at the thought of wearing men's clothing, but she pushed the feeling aside. Modesty was a luxury she could not afford right now, and besides, August had already turned his back to give her privacy. She slipped behind the curtain and peeled off her frozen dress with fingers that still trembled from cold and exhaustion. The water in the pitcher was ice cold, but she used it anyway, scrubbing the grime from her face and hands before putting on the shirt and pants that August had left for her. They were indeed too large, and she had to roll up the sleeves and pant legs multiple times, but they were clean and dry and smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke. When she emerged from behind the curtain, August had finished feeding the dog and was stirring something on the stove. The smell of cooking meat made Violet's stomach clench with hunger, and she realized she could not remember the last real meal she had eaten. August glanced at her and nodded approvingly at her changed appearance. "Much better," he said. "Sit down, and I will get you some food. It is just stew, nothing fancy, but it is hot and filling." Violet sank into one of the chairs and watched as he ladled thick brown stew into a bowl and set it in front of her with a spoon. She wanted to eat slowly and maintain some dignity, but the moment the first bite hit her tongue, she was lost. She ate with the same desperate hunger as the dog, barely tasting the food as she shoveled it into her mouth. August said nothing, just refilled her bowl when she emptied it and then did it again. It was only after the third bowl that Violet felt the sharp edge of her hunger begin to dull, and she set down her spoon with a long sigh. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I do not know how to repay such kindness." "You already told me how," August replied. "You will cook and clean and mend. That is payment enough for me." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the stove and the soft breathing of the dog, who had curled up into a tight ball near the warmth. Violet studied August's face in the firelight, noting the lines of weariness around his eyes and the way his shoulders seemed to carry some invisible weight. He was handsome, she realized, in a rough, weathered way that spoke of a life lived outdoors in all kinds of weather. "How long have you been in Beaver?" she asked, curious about this man who had taken her in without hesitation. 3 years, August said. "I came west from Missouri after the war ended. Worked as a ranch hand for a while, then saved enough money to buy this livery stable. It is not much, but it is mine. The war," Violet repeated softly. The Civil War had ended 16 years ago, but its effects still rippled through the country like stones thrown into water. You fought. I did, August said, and his voice took on a harder edge. On the Union side, though it cost me my family. My father was a Confederate sympathizer, and when I enlisted with the North, he disowned me. I have not spoken to him or my mother or my sisters since 1862. The pain in his words was so raw that Violet felt tears prick her eyes. I am sorry, she said. That must be very difficult. August shrugged, but the gesture was stiff and unconvincing. It was my choice to make, and I stand by it. Some things are worth losing family over. But it left me alone in the world, and I have been wandering ever since, trying to find a place that feels like home. And has Beaver become that place? Violet asked. He considered the question carefully before answering. It is starting to, he said. The people here are good, hard-working folks. They leave me alone mostly, which suits me fine. I have my horses and my work, and that has been enough. Until tonight, anyway. Until tonight, Violet echoed, confused. August looked at her, and in his gray eyes she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Until I met someone who saved a dying dog in a blizzard, even though she barely had the strength to save herself. That kind of courage and compassion is rare, Miss Harper. It makes me think that maybe there is more to life than just work and solitude. Violet did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The moment stretched between them, charged with an awareness that was both thrilling and terrifying. She had known this man for less than an hour, and yet she felt a connection to him that defied logic or reason. Perhaps it was the extremity of her circumstances, or perhaps it was something deeper and more fundamental, but she could not deny that when she looked at August Garrett, she felt something shift inside her chest. The spell was broken by the dog stirring near the stove and whimpering softly. August rose and went to check on the animal, running his hands gently over her fur. She needs a name, he said over his shoulder. We cannot just keep calling her the dog. Violet thought about it, watching the way the firelight played across the animal's golden coat. Goldie, she said finally. It seems fitting. Goldie it is, August agreed. He returned to the table and sat down again, his expression thoughtful. Now, Miss Harper, I need to know your story. How did you end up walking through a blizzard in the middle of December? Violet took a deep breath and began to talk. She told him about her life in Kansas City, where she had worked as a seamstress in a dress shop after her mother died of consumption 3 years earlier. She told him about her father, a gambler and a drunk who had disappeared when she was 12, leaving her and her mother to fend for themselves. She told him about the offer of work in California that had prompted her to take the stagecoach west, hoping for a fresh start in a new place. And she told him about the broken axle and the driver riding off, leaving her stranded in the wilderness. I walked for 3 days, she said quietly. I thought I was going to die out there. And then I heard Goldie crying, and suddenly I had a reason to keep going. I could not let her die alone. August was silent for a long moment after she finished. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in his touch warm and solid and real. You are the bravest person I have ever met, he said simply. And I am honored that you found your way to my door. Violet felt tears spill down her cheeks, and she did not try to stop them. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with such genuine respect and admiration, so long since she had felt valued as a person rather than just a pair of hands to sew or clean. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. You are welcome, August replied. Now you need rest. You can take the bed and I will sleep out in the stable. It is warm enough out there and I have done it before. I cannot take your bed, Violet protested. That is not fair to you. Fair has nothing to do with it, August said firmly. You are recovering from exposure and exhaustion. You need proper rest in a proper bed. I will be fine, and that is the end of the discussion. Violet wanted to argue, but she could see from the set of his jaw that it would be pointless. August Garrett was clearly a man who made up his mind and stuck to it. So she simply nodded and rose from the table, every muscle in her body suddenly screaming with fatigue. August showed her to the bed, which was narrow but had thick blankets and a pillow that smelled like him, clean and masculine. "If you need anything during the night, just call out," he said from the doorway. "I will be close by." "August," Violet said, stopping him before he could leave. "Why are you doing this? Really?" He turned back to look at her, and his expression was both tender and sad. "Because someone showed me kindness once when I needed it most," he said. "And because I know what it is like to be alone in the world with nowhere to go. And because when I look at you, I see something worth protecting." Before Violet could respond, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. She lay down on the bed and pulled the blankets up to her chin, her mind spinning with everything that had happened in the past few hours. Goldie padded over and curled up on the floor beside the bed, her presence a comfort in the darkness. Violet reached down and stroked the dog's head, feeling the animal's warmth and the steady rise and fall of her breathing. "We are safe," she whispered to Goldie. "We found someone good, I think, someone who will help us." The dog whined softly in response, and Violet closed her eyes, letting exhaustion finally pull her under into dreamless sleep. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's single window, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. Violet sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore but no longer weak with cold and hunger. She could hear movement outside, the sound of horses whinnying and August's deep voice talking to them in soothing tones. Goldie was gone from her spot beside the bed, and when Violet pushed aside the blankets and stood up, she saw the dog sitting by the door, tail wagging slowly. "Want to go outside?" Violet asked, and Goldie barked once in response. Violet opened the door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The storm had passed during the night, leaving Beaver covered in a fresh blanket of snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. The livery stable was busy with activity, and she saw August leading a large bay horse out of one of the stalls. He looked up when he heard the door open and smiled, and the expression transformed his serious face into something warm and approachable. "Good morning," he called. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," Violet admitted. She walked over to where he stood, careful to avoid the patches of ice on the ground. Goldie bounded ahead of her, sniffing at everything with renewed energy. "Thank you for the bed. Where did you sleep?" "In the hayloft," August said, nodding toward the stable. "It was comfortable enough." "I have slept in worse places, believe me." Violet felt a pang of guilt but pushed it aside. August was right that she had needed proper rest, and she could not help him if she was sick or injured. "What can I do to help today?" she asked. "I meant what I said about working for my keep." August considered her for a moment, his gray eyes assessing. "Can you really cook?" "I can," Violet confirmed. "Give me ingredients and a stove, and I will make you a meal you will not forget." "Then that is what you will do," August decided. "I have been living on stew and beans for the past 3 years, and while it keeps me alive, it is not exactly exciting. I have supplies in the cabin, flour and sugar and dried fruit. See what you can make of it." Violet nodded and returned to the cabin with a sense of purpose that felt wonderful after so many days of aimless wandering. She surveyed the supplies August had mentioned and found them adequate if not abundant.